Welcome to the lecture video on corporate social responsibility. And this is an important tool for international managers to use. It's increasingly an integral part of doing business globally. So I think it's very important for everyone to know exactly what this is and how you can use it. So let's start with just some brief definitions. Some of these are famous definitions, actually, and I've cited the author, the source of this at the back. But basically, this is saying that this is something that goes beyond strictly the legal or economic or technical requirements of the firm. This is something, again, this is looking at the obligation of the firm to society, or more specifically to the firm's stakeholders. And that's a key word that I want you to keep in mind, stakeholders. Those affected by corporate policies and practices, right? And so that's basically anyone that is affected in any way by what the corporation does. And so later we're going to learn how to do a stakeholder analysis. And essentially all that is just identifying who is affected by your company's actions and practices, and how could they be affected, how could they react to you, how can you address some of those concerns before they become a problem for you. And that, in effect, is essentially what this corporate social responsibility is about. And I think that if we want to try to identify this and look at some of the core characteristics of a company's corporate social responsibility strategy, it would be defined by some core characteristics, some very key things would have to be met to say that, oh yes, that company is implementing a CSR. Now we just use the abbreviation for corporate social responsibility as CSR. That company is implementing an effective CSR strategy. So we would say the company is doing an effective CSR strategy if what it is doing is voluntary. In other words, it is doing something for social benefit that is more than what is required by law. And there could be a debate. Is the company doing this genuinely to help the societal groups or the people involved, or is it doing it just to preempt regulations? And so that is where there could be both, right? It could be both. So let's give you an example. One example might be McDonald's, right? Implemented this idea of calorie labeling, putting the label of how much, how many calories on each one of its food items. Now, was that done just to help people, or was that done to possibly prevent even tougher mandatory regulations in some countries? For example, they might decide to ban outright McDonald's because it's unhealthy, but McDonald's could say, look, we're doing this as a service. We're trying to be very conscious of these concerns. This is a socially responsible thing we're doing. So it's a voluntary thing. It wasn't, McDonald's started doing this before they were required to do this. And the idea was, well, maybe in some countries they started doing this as a way to prevent even tougher regulations from coming down on them. So you could debate, was it done genuinely to help people or to prevent even tougher regulations, or maybe a combination of both? But again, it was voluntarily, it went above what was required by law, at least initially, okay? Another aspect of corporate social responsibility is that it's managing externalities, right? So externalities are things that are something above and beyond what maybe the company is producing. Let's say it's producing a certain kind of product, and as a result, one of the things that results is terrible pollution, or certain kinds of harmful emissions, or certain kind of chemicals going into the river. Well, a company that takes actions so that others will not bear the cost of its actions, right, will clean up the harmful emissions, will reduce its carbon emissions voluntarily above what is required by the law. Maybe we'll try to take action before it even pollutes in the first place. That's a company that is doing a good job of managing externalities. And so this is, again, would be characteristic of an effective corporate social responsibility strategy. And I think, again, we see this word stakeholder again, multiple stakeholder orientation. So managers are normally trained that you should maximize the value of the company for the shareholders. You should try to increase the value of this company. That's one of your missions as a manager. So the corporate social responsibility perspective on this is Well, yes, you should increase profits and increase the value of the company for the shareholders, but there are others who are affected by what the company does. What about the consumers? What about all those people eating the McDonald's hamburgers? What about the employees? What about the suppliers? What about local communities? If you're a big mining company, you might have an impact on the local community by what you're doing. So again, these are stakeholders, and an effective corporate social responsibility strategy takes anyone affected by what the company does into account. That's what stakeholders are. Now, a good corporate social responsibility strategy would have an alignment of social and economic responsibilities. So although CSR goes beyond the narrow focus on shareholders and profits, it should not conflict with that, right? And so, it should say, we're doing this as a way not to reduce our profits, but as a way to, in fact, it could even be a way to enhance the profits. Maybe we develop such good public relations for what we're doing that more people buy our hamburgers or something like that. So that's the kind of some of the key characteristics of corporate social responsibility. One last final aspect of this is that it's beyond philanthropy. So philanthropy is where, you're giving money to a charity, or you're doing something for a good cause, you're giving this or you're doing that. But increasingly, corporate social responsibility is not just seen as, this is a kind of a bolted on thing. We're just, we're an aircraft manufacturing company, but we also donate a lot of money to, saving rescue dogs or breast cancer or something like that. Well, that's not completely an integral part of their business activity, is it? We would call that sort of a bolted on. It's giving money to charity, it's doing something nice, but it's not integral to what the company is already doing. So increasingly, CSR, effective CSR at least, is seen as how the core functions of the company can have a positive impact on society. That's a built-in strategy rather than a bolted-on strategy. So let me give an example of that. So, for example, Walmart said, it's the CEO of Walmart was saying we'd like to be more sustainable. We'd like to, implement corporate social responsibility, do something that would have an impact, a positive impact on society. And so the CEO of Walmart and other leaders at Walmart noticed that a lot of the suppliers that were providing products to Walmart had a lot of extra packaging and plastic and cardboard and things in the packages of all their products. And so Walmart said, this is really creating a lot of waste and terrible plastics, and it's filling up the landfills, and it's causing an environmental problem. And so maybe we could get our suppliers, we could tell them, we want you to reduce the amount of packaging, reduce the amount of plastics you're using because it causes such damage to the environment. Well, that was a great thing that had a positive social impact, but at the same time, it also reduced the cost for the suppliers, which reduced the cost for Walmart in buying those supplies, which then made it easier for Walmart to pass on savings to the customers, which was an integral part of their business proposition. So that's a built-in strategy, you see. And what is nice about having a built-in integral part of your strategy, kind of CSR strategy, is that it's going to be more successful and viable in the long term. The board of the directors of Walmart would never say, well, gee, we're not going to do that. It's wasting money. No, it's actually saving Walmart money. It's helping their profits. It's encouraging them to improve their bottom line, right? So a bolted-on strategy, some board of directors might say, why are we giving all this money to rescue dogs? It doesn't make any sense for us to do this, and it's costing us a lot of money. We'll stop it. So I think that's why going beyond philanthropy to this kind of built-in strategy rather than bolted on is such an important part of a corporate social responsibility strategy. And so when you are doing your analysis of a company, right, and you're saying, okay, will this company be successful in country X? One of the things you can do is you can say, does it have an effective corporate social responsibility strategy? Is that CSR strategy a built-in strategy or a bolted-on strategy? Does it meet these other key characteristics of CSR and effective CSR strategy? So that's one thing that would be very useful. For example, if you're looking at Nike in China and deciding, will they be successful and effective? CSR in that particular case is extremely important because Nike, had some problems where they were outsourcing the manufacturing of their shoes to some companies that were, not treating the workers well, and it hurt Nike's image. And so Nike realized they needed to have an effective CSR strategy in China. Otherwise, eventually it could come back and maybe consumers wouldn't want to buy their shoes. And it could even come back and hurt them in other places like Europe and the United States as well. So that is when they realized that this kind of thing wasn't just something that would be bolted on, a nice thing to do, but actually an integral part of their business model. And so increasingly companies are finding that to be the case. So we're going to look at some cases of mining companies, and mining companies have found CSR to be crucially important because sometimes they might go into a local community. If the local community is not happy with them, or if the mining company is not following good societal practices and treating the local people, the local communities in a good way, and causing a lot of harm or pollution or something like that, the mining company might not be able to go in and do its mining activity anymore. So this is the kind of thing that companies need, not just the legal license to operate, but in many places they need also the social license to operate. They need the social acceptance and approval actually to do their business effectively. So that's part of what social responsibility is all about. So now there has been, at least in the 1970s, there were some people that were very adamantly opposed. And even today there are people that are opposed to corporate social responsibility, but increasingly I think companies are finding it to be so central and essential that this kind of view is no longer really valid or considered to be valid. And so, but Milton Friedman was a famous liberal economist, liberal in the sense we use it in this course, where he believed very much in minimal government interference in the economy. And so he looked at corporate social responsibility, or he looked at managers getting involved in this kind of thing and companies involving themselves in this sort of thing, and said, managers shouldn't be doing this. Managers are trained to maximize value of the company for the shareholders, to find ways to reduce costs, to keep profits high, to find new markets. Managers are not trained to get involved with social kinds of things and these kinds of actions. So managers employing CSR are wasting the shareholders' money. Managers, by doing that, are taking their eye off the ball on maximizing profits and value, and the company could go bankrupt, and that would not help anybody. So his argument, Milton Friedman, and he's a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, right, and very prominent in the 1970s in the United States, said managers are not competent to deal with these kinds of social issues. They should stay away. They should focus on their core mission. So increasingly, I think that companies are now making the case, in a famous article on corporate social responsibility, whether to do it or how to do it, by Craig Smith, said, there not only are normative reasons for doing this, that it's the right thing to do things that are good for society, but there also is a business case for doing this, that it actually enhances the company's self-interest, it enhances its profits. And so an example of that might be, and this is, again, this author gave this example, there's a famous British pharmaceutical company, GlaxoSmithKline, and it's a famous case back then. GlaxoSmithKline, during the AIDS epidemic, when it was really raging in South Africa, had developed, had a pharmaceutical product that could actually combat AIDS, and actually was very effective at this, but it was extremely expensive. And GlaxoSmithKline, of course, had a patent on this pharmaceutical product and was getting huge royalties from this product. But South Africa said, we have a big AIDS epidemic in our country. We would like to just distribute generics. In other words, products that are just copies of this thing. Chemists can easily figure that out, and they could just distribute that at very low cost without paying all the royalties to GlaxoSmithKline. And so that's what South African government sought to do. Now, GlaxoSmithKline, of course, was horrified, and other pharmaceutical companies said, this is terrible. We're going to take you to court. We're not going to allow this. And there was a huge dispute and debate about this. And so finally, I think GlaxoSmithKline realized that there were so many protests and people were so upset and people were dying. And so it realized that it better change its practices fast, or it was not going to have any consumers buying its products. It would not have anybody buying its stock. Nobody would want to have anything to do with them. Nobody would want to work for them. So GlaxoSmithKline said, okay, well, in emerging markets, in places like South Africa, we'll have a different pricing strategy. We'll sell at a very low price, but that'll let us keep our patent at least, right? And so that, okay, did GlaxoSmithKline do this kind of thing to be just as a normative reasons, it's the right thing to do, or was it a business case? If they hadn't done it, then they might completely lose their patent, right? There might be some kind of court battle, and they could be given it, told we're not gonna honor your patent. In the end, I think something like that did happen, but so that's kind of the idea here, right? So there's a business reason as well as a normative reason in many cases. So the business case for CSR is pretty clear. I mean, so there's a lot of different reasons companies may choose to do this. They may want to avoid or preempt tougher regulations. Remember that example of McDonald's putting the calories labels on, to prevent the government from doing something even more drastic to them. There might be economic efficiencies. We talked about Walmart reducing the amount of packaging. It benefits Walmart, bottom line, as well as being good for society. Another example might be something like Starbucks teaming up with Arizona State University to create, their great program that they have. And this is a wonderful program where, if you work for Starbucks long enough, you get a chance to get a degree online at ASU. And Starbucks will pay for it, right? And so I think that this is a great thing for Starbucks. It's a wonderful thing they're doing. It's a normative, wonderful benefit they're doing. But at the same time, think what it does. The best employees at Starbucks then are less likely to just quit or to move around. They're going to say, gee, I'm going to stay at Starbucks long enough until I can get that benefit, and until I can get through my degree at ASU, right? And so I think that by reducing turnover, which in a business that Starbucks has, constantly the turnover, the churn of employees, new employees coming every week, oh my gosh, the cost of training these new employees, the disruption. Wouldn't they rather have their best employees sticking out at least for a few years, getting their undergraduate degree, and then maybe becoming an executive at Starbucks? Who knows? So Thunderbird, of course, we had for many years, and I think he's still there, the head of the international division of Starbucks, is a Thunderbird alumnus, by the way. So these are some reasons. So again, we see some of these reasons, and this third one listed there, reputation in consumer markets. Well, of course, that's a big one. And of course, sometimes consumers would say, gee, I'm going to buy those eggs because those chickens were, cage-free chickens. And so the eggs, I feel better buying those eggs, and I'm going to pay more for them, right? Or sometimes, you might find a company that does these kinds of things because it'll make them more attractive to prospective employees. I think Goldman Sachs, one of the things they did is they started a program called, 10,000 women. We're going to train 10,000 women entrepreneurs all over the world in their micro businesses. Thunderbird was involved with that for some time. Thunderbird is doing that kind of thing. Thunderbird has its own sort of CSR strategy called Thunderbird for Good, where we actually train women entrepreneurs all over the world. And so Thunderbird, people that work with Thunderbird are very proud of that. It attracts people and students to Thunderbird. They say, gee, I like working at a school like that, or going to a school that would do something like that. And I would say that's very much a built-in sort of thing, because by training women entrepreneurs with their small micro businesses to be more effective managers, well, that's something Thunderbird does already, right, at a different level, different scale. So that's very much a built-in strategy for Thunderbird. So in any case, so you can see that there is a strong business case. There's a lot of business reasons for companies to engage in this CSR, and that's, I think, why it's increasingly an integral part of every company's business strategy. Now, to do this effectively is more of a challenge, right? And so I think it's important that the organizational fit is key. So, for mining companies, doing things for the local community, making sure you're not polluting or putting mercury into the water or something like that, would be a very much thing that would help contribute to their license to operate in local communities. But of course, something like that might be completely irrelevant for a bank, right? So again, the organizational fit, the kind of corporate social responsibility strategy a company uses depends on the nature of the organization. And, there are some key questions. And so if you're evaluating a company, let's say as part of your, presentation project, you are going to be evaluating companies. And one thing you could consider, do they have an effective CSR strategy? You could say, well, okay, is this an effective strategy? How responsive would customers be to this kind of CSR strategy? Can improvements be made that would prevent tough regulations? Would customers pay more for a product if this CSR strategy was used? So these are some key things you might keep in mind as you're evaluating a company's CSR strategy or lack of strategy. You could say they could use one, right? So now there's increasingly a new concept, and I put new maybe between quotation marks, called creating shared value. Now, this was developed by the very famous strategy professor at Harvard Business School named Michael Porter and one of his former students, Mark Kramer. And they published this concept, and Michael Porter has become famous talking about creating shared value. And what's interesting about this, though, is it looks a lot like corporate social responsibility, just slightly, twisted or a little bit tweaked in some way. But basically, look, here is Michael Porter's definition of creating shared value. And you might even be asked about this. Sometimes employees find themselves asked about things like this in job interviews. What do you think about creating shared value? Right? And so here's what this is. Policies and operating practices that enhance the competitiveness of a company while simultaneously advancing the economic and social conditions in the communities in which that company operates. Isn't that just CSR? Isn't that what we just were talking about is CSR? So maybe this is a way for Michael Porter to put a new twist on this. Maybe there are some interesting aspects. It's a very, this article that he wrote on creating shared value is one of the most cited articles, the most famous articles. I mentioned Nestle Corporation in a previous video. He is famous at Nestle. His influence very strong on there in creating shared value at Nestle. But this is one of the things he says. Now he says, companies can create shared value by reconceiving products and markets or redefining productivity in the value chain. So let's talk about some ways you can reconceive products and markets. So for example, Vodafone, right, has, provides telecommunication services. People use the Vodafone service. And, this allows people to get access via phones to internet and those kinds of things. And so this is something that Vodafone recognized that in Africa, many African countries, people didn't really have adequate access to banking services. But there might be a way that they could do this via the internet, electronically on their phones. There's a way. And so this is an example of something that Vodafone did in Africa, giving people access that maybe might be in remote locations where there wasn't adequate banking, where they could do online banking, right? And so this is one of the things that they did very well. They reconceived their product and markets and said maybe there's a market, maybe at the base of the pyramid, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic strata that we hadn't conceived that maybe there could be a market we hadn't even thought about before. And so this is something that Michael Porter would identify. And redefining productivity in the value chain. So for example, Coca-Cola, right? When it makes its product, it uses a lot of water. Well, if they could find ways to reduce the amount of water being used, that would have a positive societal impact. Maybe an even more effective example might be Nestle, an espresso coffee example, right? Nestle Corporation training coffee farmers, right? And they make the Nespresso, they make the instant coffee. That's one of their great products. But one of the things they did is they said, well, we could help poor farmers that are helping us and providing us with the coffee beans if we trained them, right? And we gave them fertilizer and gave them some special training. And actually, if you see down there, that another aspect of this, enabling clusters of farmers to share their knowledge with each other, well, then that would create, reduce some of our costs and the farmers' costs and provide a more ample supply of coffee and provide a more reliable supplier, more steady and high quality coffee beans to us. And so the idea was that, you're doing something, it seems like you're spending money to help these poor farmers, but actually it's helping your own business, creating a more reliable supply, right? So these kinds of things. Johnson & Johnson instituted an anti-smoking campaign for its employees. Well, that was a wonderful thing to do for the employees, helping them get off of the smoking, but it also they found that it improved the productivity of their employees. They weren't out there taking big smoke breaks every hour. So these are things that in some ways it seems similar to the corporate social responsibility, some aspects of this. Perhaps it's framed in a somewhat different way, but this creating shared value is, you can see, quite related to the concept of corporate social responsibility, very similar to that. And it's a very key concept that you will hear people throw around and talk about. And I think it's very important for managers to know and be aware of that. So those are the things I wanted to say about corporate social responsibility. You can see I have cited some of these sources if you want to look them up and look at them later. But I also wanted to use this as an example for you if you're giving a presentation and you have a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, for example. Even something like that, I still think that you could use these parenthetical citations within the text of the presentation, as I did, and then provide an alphabetized list of works cited at the end. So that's what I wanted to say about corporate social responsibility. And now we can move on to the next topic.